There is a kind of loneliness that doesn't look like loneliness. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't ask for help. It doesn't even feel dramatic. It simply exists quietly in the background of a person's life. Some people move through the world without friends, not temporarily, not between phases, but as a long-term condition of their lives. They go to work, they make small talk, they function, they smile when required, and yet there is no one who truly knows them. This is the psychology of people who have no friends. Not as a flaw, not as a failure, but as a slow adaptation shaped by experience, silence, and survival. His name was Daniel. From the outside, Daniel looked ordinary. Nothing about him signaled isolation. He dressed normally, spoke politely, didn't avoid people, didn't cling to them either. He lived alone in a quiet apartment, paid his bills, kept his routines, answered fine when asked how he was doing, and in a practical sense that answer was accurate. But there were no names he thought of when something good happened, no one he texted without a reason, no shared history that lived outside his own mind. Daniel didn't wake up one day without friends. There was no moment where everything collapsed. Instead, things thinned, people drifted, conversations shortened, messages went unanswered, plans dissolved without explanation, and nothing dramatic, nothing worth confronting. Just enough distance added each time to make reaching out feel slightly more difficult than staying quiet. At some point, Daniel stopped initiating, not because he didn't care, not because he disliked people. It simply felt safer not to expect anything back. There is a common misunderstanding about people like Daniel, that they prefer solitude, that they are antisocial, that they don't need connection. But the absence of friends is rarely about preference. It is about what happens when connection becomes uncertain. When the mind learns, slowly and repeatedly, that reaching out carries risk, that attachment leads to disappointment. That being open doesn't always end in closeness. The brain adapts. It doesn't do this loudly. It does it subtly, by lowering expectations, by dampening desire, by making detachment feel like neutrality. Daniel began to tell himself he was independent, low maintenance, easygoing, and maybe he was. But late at night, when there was no one left to perform normalcy for, something heavier would surface. A quiet sense of displacement, like standing just outside a room full of people, hearing their voices through the wall. Loneliness like this doesn't feel sharp. It feels dull. It settles in the body without words. Psychologically, human beings are not built for long-term social absence. For most of our history, belonging was not emotional. It was survival. To be part of a group meant protection, food, safety. To be alone meant danger. That wiring still lives inside us. When social connection fades, the brain doesn't interpret it as neutral. It interprets it as threat, not enough to trigger panic, just enough to create vigilance. Daniel began scanning conversations for signs of disinterest, replaying interactions afterward, wondering if he had spoken too much or not enough. None of these thoughts were loud. They didn't feel like anxiety. They felt like realism. Over time, Daniel learned how to exist without being noticed, how to take up less space, how to make himself easy to overlook. And the world adjusted accordingly. This is how friendlessness often forms, not through rejection, but through gradual invisibility. And the longer it lasts, the more it begins to feel permanent. by the time someone realizes they have no friends, the absence has already shaped who they are. And that is where the deeper story begins. There is a shift that happens when loneliness stops feeling circumstantial and starts feeling structural. Daniel couldn't name the exact moment. There was no turning point, no breakdown, no single person who stopped calling. Just months folding into years. Years without names saved in his phone that he could call for no reason. Without inside jokes carried across time. Without anyone who remembered earlier versions of him. At first, he told himself it was temporary, that adult friendships would form eventually, through work, through hobbies, through chance. But adulthood doesn't create friendships the way childhood does. There's no recess, no assigned seating, no natural collision of lives. Everything requires deliberate action, planning, energy, follow through. And when you already feel like an afterthought, it's hard to believe anyone would prioritize you. So Daniel waited for invitations that didn't come, and waiting became a pattern. The psychology of chronic loneliness involves more than sadness. It involves hypervigilance. The brain becomes attuned to potential rejection, even in neutral situations. A delayed text means disinterest, a short reply means dismissal. An unreturned call means you've been forgotten. This isn't irrational, it's protective. The nervous system is trying to minimize harm. If connection has been inconsistent or painful, the mind learns to anticipate absence, to brace for it, to expect less, so disappointment hurts less. Daniel noticed this shift in himself. He stopped assuming he was welcome. He interpreted silences as confirmation. He declined opportunities before they could disappoint him. Not consciously, not dramatically, just quietly, reflexively. And over time, this internal guarding became externally visible. Not in obvious ways, but in subtleties. In the way he hesitated before speaking. In the way he left gatherings slightly earlier than everyone else. In the way he occupied space like someone who expected to be temporary. People sense this without naming it, and they respond to it. There is a feedback mechanism here. Loneliness creates withdrawal. Withdrawal creates absence. Absence reinforces the belief that you don't belong. Each cycle strengthens the pattern. Society doesn't discuss this kind of loneliness often, the undramatic kind. The kind without crisis, the kind that looks like functioning from the outside. But neuroscience shows that prolonged social isolation activates stress responses similar to physical danger. Chronic loneliness increases cortisol, disrupts sleep architecture, heightens inflammation, weakens immune response, not because people are fragile, but because connection is biological. Daniel didn't feel constantly anxious. He felt muted, distant, like he was watching life happen rather than participating in it. He consumed media, read articles, followed conversations online, but rarely felt present in anything unfolding in real time. He existed parallel to life, and here is something crucial. Having no friends doesn't always reflect poor social skills. Often it reflects a lack of social safety. The difference between being tolerated and being wanted, between being useful and being chosen, between being interesting and being essential. Without that safety, people either perform or retreat. Daniel did both. He learned to be pleasant, helpful, agreeable, and then he learned to disappear before anyone could decide they didn't need him. He began to see himself as expendable, forgettable, a background character in other people's narratives. And once that belief settles, it colours perception entirely. Success feels hollow. Moments of joy feel incomplete. Even positive experiences carry a faint emptiness, because there is no one to share them with. There is a philosophical dimension to this. Identity is partly constructed through reflection. We know ourselves through how others see us, through how we are remembered, through the space we occupy in someone else's thoughts. When those reflections vanish, the self becomes unstable, not fragmented, just unmoored. This is why loneliness often carries existential weight. Who am I if no one knows me? Does my life matter beyond my own perception? Would anyone notice if I disappeared? Daniel didn't catastrophize. He didn't fall apart, but there was a persistent feeling of unreality. Like his existence lacked substance, like he could vanish and the world would continue without friction. And that feeling is more devastating than dramatic pain, because it's quiet enough to feel factual. You might recognize that feeling, the strange weight of existing without witnesses, the way isolation doesn't always announce itself through tears or desperation. Sometimes it just sits there, unspoken, shaping thoughts in the background. Daniel noticed it most in small moments, when something mildly amusing happened and there was no one to tell. When he saw groups laughing together and felt something unnamed. When entire weekends passed with no interruption and no expectation of interruption. It wasn't that he believed he was fundamentally broken, at least not in a way he could articulate. But over time, the lack of friendship began to feel like evidence, as if the silence itself was communicating something about his worth. Psychologists describe belonging as a core human need, not optional, not supplementary, as fundamental as food or sleep. For most of human evolution, social bonds weren't about happiness. They were about survival. Being excluded from the group wasn't just lonely, it was deadly. And that ancient circuitry remains active. When the brain detects prolonged social disconnection, it doesn't process it as emotionally uncomfortable. It processes it as dangerous. Research demonstrates that social rejection activates neural pathways overlapping with physical pain. The brain treats exclusion and injury with similar urgency. Both signal vulnerability. Daniel didn't understand any of this. He just knew that the longer he went without close connections, the harder it became to imagine having them. Social interactions began to feel foreign, like a skill he'd once possessed but hadn't practiced in so long he'd lost fluency. He would analyze conversations afterward, question whether he'd contributed too much or too little, wonder if his presence felt awkward to others, unnecessary. These weren't catastrophic thoughts. They were quiet conclusions, subtle assessments accumulated over time. Maybe people simply don't need me in their lives. And here's where the psychology becomes layered. Because loneliness doesn't only result from being actively rejected. Sometimes it emerges from a slow, almost invisible withdrawal, one small decision at a time, until the world has reorganized itself around your absence. Daniel wasn't deliberately excluded. He became easy to forget. Modern existence facilitates this more than ever. Work is transactional. Communication fragments across platforms. Social connection becomes increasingly performative, curated, digital. It's possible to be perpetually reachable and profoundly isolated. We're encouraged to substitute intimacy with accessibility, to replace community with content consumption, to exchange friendship for distraction. And for a while, the substitution almost feels adequate, until it doesn't. Because the brain continues tracking what's missing. It notices when no one asks how you're actually doing, when your existence doesn't disrupt anyone else's routine, when you could vanish and nothing would change, and gradually it internalizes that information. Daniel started believing that needing people indicated weakness, that wanting closeness meant something was deficient within him. So he adjusted his expectations downward, avoided vulnerability by avoiding attachment entirely. He became proficient at solitude, but proficiency doesn't eliminate pain. It just makes the pain quieter. There's a specific grief that accompanies having no friends. Not the grief of losing someone, the grief of possibility. The sense that somewhere a different version of life is happening and you're watching it from outside. Daniel felt that grief without identifying it. It manifested as numbness, as absence of motivation, as the sensation that time was moving, but nothing anchored him to its passage. And this is what rarely gets acknowledged. Loneliness doesn't just create sadness, it alters self-perception. Without other people as mirrors, identity becomes blurred. You lose track of how you're perceived. You lose certainty about where you fit. The absence transforms into a message. And once that message embeds itself, dislodging it becomes difficult. Daniel would reassure himself that he was fine, that this was simply adulthood, that friendships naturally fade, that everyone is overwhelmed with their own lives. And those statements contain truth, but they don't contain the whole truth. Because underneath those rational explanations lived a quieter question he avoided asking directly. What if this isn't just circumstance? What if this is simply who I've become? That question lingered, unanswered, heavy. But the absence of friends is not evidence of unworthiness. It is often the product of timing, environment, emotional history, invisible patterns established long ago, attachment styles formed in childhood, early experiences of being overlooked, moments where reaching out didn't feel safe. These forces don't advertise themselves. They shape behavior silently. Daniel wasn't defective. He was adapted to a specific set of conditions. An adaptation, when recognized, can be reshaped, not through force, not through performance, but through awareness, through understanding that loneliness is not a personal failure, but a human signal. A signal that something essential has been absent. The story doesn't end with Daniel suddenly surrounded by friends. That wouldn't be honest. It ends with something smaller, quieter. It ends with him beginning to understand that his isolation had a history, that it made sense given the circumstances, that it wasn't a verdict on his value, but a response to a world that doesn't make connection easy. He began to see his aloneness not as proof of defect, but as information, something worth examining, not silencing. And perhaps that's where this story leaves you as well. Not with answers, not with instructions, but with recognition. Because if you've ever felt like Daniel, if you've ever moved through life feeling peripheral, unnoticed, quietly separate, then this isn't a story about someone else. It's a story about a profoundly human experience that rarely gets named. And sometimes being seen in that experience is where something begins to shift. Not all at once, just enough to matter.